Afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on armed conflict, starvation, and international humanitarian law. I've been an anti-hunger advocate for a long time. I know that when people hear the word hunger, often what comes to mind is some kind of scarcity or lack of food that's due to factors beyond our control. But most of the time, that's not the case. Hunger is a political condition. It is due to choices that human beings, oftentimes leaders of various countries, make. One of those choices is about how to conduct war. Last December, the United Nations World Food Program reported that 811 million people were facing hunger, of whom almost 60% lived in areas affected by armed violence. In January, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, along with WFP, released their February to May 2022 outlook on global hunger hotspots. They reported that food insecurity would likely get worse in 20 countries. The most acute situations include Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Yemen, all of which are experiencing armed conflict. Conflict is not the only cause of hunger, but it is a main driver in 8 out of 10 of the worst hunger crises in the world today. This was already the case before Russia launched its war of aggression against Ukraine, a main supplier of wheat to Africa and the Middle East. I want to emphasize that we're not talking about collateral damage. We're talking about intentional decisions to wage war in ways that directly or indirectly undermine people's access to food and put them at risk for starvation. This happened in Syria when civilians were trapped in besieged cities. It is happening in Ethiopia as people are systematically denied access to humanitarian relief. And it happened in Burma, where destruction of farmland and villages, along with restrictions on movement, were used against Rohingya. The link between conflict and hunger and starvation is well known. 4 years ago, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2417 that explicitly recognized the link between armed conflict, food insecurity, and famine, and recalled that international humanitarian law, the use, and recall that the international humanitarian law prohibits the use of hunger as a weapon. In fact, to intentionally cause starvation of civilians is a war crime, a violation of both the Geneva Conventions and the Rome Statute. When people hear the words war crime, starving civilians is probably not the first thing that comes to mind. We're more likely to think about the bombing of whole cities, the destruction of medical facilities, killing civilians in cold blood, the kinds of images we're seeing come out of Ukraine as we speak. And that's why I wanted to hold this hearing today. We need to shift our thinking about hunger and starvation when these are linked to armed conflict. We should not assume that hunger is somehow a natural consequence of war. We should be asking whether it's the result of intentional decisions that make it a war crime. And if investigations show a war crime, we should be insisting on accountability for those responsible. And we'll hear today there are truly important efforts underway to develop ways to do that. The issue has even found its way into a court case here in the United States. A month ago, the federal court in Virginia ruled that a civil claim for damages could proceed against Libyan warlord General Khalifa Haftar, who was accused of war crimes, including starvation sieges. And let me be clear that seeking accountability for those who purposefully cause starvation is not in any way a substitute for providing desperately needed humanitarian assistance to hunger hotspots. On the contrary, providing humanitarian assistance is a way to support the victims of war crimes, and the U.S. has been a strong leader on this front. But even as humanitarian agencies like FAO and WFP respond to existing hunger crises, we need attention to prevention as well. That means strategies to build resilience, like those we'll hear about from FAO in a few minutes. And what I'm calling for is an approach in which humanitarian assistance and the building of resilience go hand in hand with accountability. So I urge members who share this concern to co-sponsor HRES 922, a bipartisan resolution led by Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, who is a member of the Human Rights Commission. The resolution condemns the use of hunger as a weapon of war and calls for sanctions against those responsible. I think this would be a first step towards accountability. And I want to say thank you to all of our witnesses. And And before I turn to our first witness, I want to yield to the distinguished co-chair of the commission, Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Chairman McGovern, Co-Chairman, and for your very eloquent opening remarks and for convening today's hearing. And I too, like you, have a great concern about human hunger, having worked on the Global Food Security Act and other bills over the course of several years. So thank you. This is an area where we are just absolutely joined together in trying to make a difference. And certainly using food as a weapon. Remember how infamously Mengistu used it in Ethiopia, starving so many people in the 1980s. And of course, there's a long line and list of countries in dictatorships and authoritarian regimes that have used food as a weapon, and they need to be held to account. You know, as we speak, we all know Vladimir Putin is waging a terrible, horrific war on the civilians and the people, all of the people of Ukraine. But as you point, it's not just the bombs, it's not just the tanks. Increasingly, as time goes on, and the inability to get food to people, particularly in besieged cities, becomes very apparent that food then becomes the critical issue that causes people to be either incredibly sick and weakened and then even die. I met with a couple of survivors the other day in my district who one of them left early from Ukraine to get an operation. He's a rabbi, and he told me how or the people in his synagogue that food, because the cupboards are bare now, you can't go out and get it. It's very hard. The supply lines coming in are threadbare because they're under attack. So food indeed is being used by Vladimir Putin to kill the people of Ukraine in addition to his other weapons. You know, we all know that there's also a consequence. As you know, Jim, Russia and Ukraine supply more than a quarter of the world's wheat, so those consequences are already being felt in disrupted supply chains, food shortages, price hikes, and political discontent in countries throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and is likely to spread throughout sub-Saharan Africa to regions whose agricultural sectors have already been impacted by COVID-19 and African desert locusts. Throughout history, politics and policy have exacerbated unexpected and irregular famines, such as the 1845 to 1852 Irish potato famine, of course, caused by an infection. Other famines are engineered, orchestrated by the evilest of actors engaging in armed conflict or punishing their own people who they deem to be enemies of the state or ideological class enemies. So, to contextualize this hearing to some extent, it's important to have an historical perspective and understanding of the role of ideology. Indeed, starvation as a weapon of mass destruction is not unknown to Ukraine itself. We all know that from 32 to 33, then the Soviet Ukraine suffered a horrific famine directed by Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. It left millions of people dead, and especially during the spring of 1933. Under the policy of collectivization that began in 1929, Stalin and the Soviets seized ownership of individual land to create collective farms while deporting kulaks, relatively rich peasants who were designated as a class enemy. Those that resisted had their homes ransacked for food and their families blacklisted for receiving sustenance from other sources outside their villages. And the state set extreme grain procurement quotas and rejected international aid. This was famine enabled genocide. The USSR secured 4.27 million tons of grain from Ukraine in 32, which is more than enough to feed 10 million people. Yet the Ukrainians starved to death. The Kremlin's methodological assault on Ukraine echoes other man made famines like the Great Chinese Famine between 59 and 61 on Chairman Mao Zedong, where at least 30 million men, women, and children starved to death. There, in the face of drought, the Chinese Communist Party launched its second 5 year plan called the Great Leap Forward, which abolished private plot farming and transferred all production, allocation, and distribution of food to the hands of the state. Ignoring the collectivization failure of the USSR and wishing to manufacture an industrial revolution from scratch, Mao forced farmers to work on communes and meet unrealistic grain quotas while requiring peasants to mine and smelt steel in backyard furnaces, in addition to death by starvation in the greatest non wartime famine in history. So-called rightists and weak links were executed as well. Meanwhile, Chairman Mao not only acknowledged but mocked the crisis. When there is not enough uh, to uh, to eat, people starve to death. It is better to let half the people die, he said, so that the other half can eat well. That is absolutely horrific. Letting class enemies starve to death is an all too common ideological weapon of communist regimes. North Korea also weaponizes hunger as a way to systematically control its population. This is evident in the long-standing system of state-sponsored discrimination called the Sungbun system. Sungbun, a Korean term that encompasses the political, social, and economic background of one's direct ancestors, as well as the social behavior of one's relatives, is used to determine whether an individual is to be trusted with responsibilities or even to receive an adequate supply of food. This is one reason why international efforts to reach the food needy in North Korea have often been thwarted by Pyongyang's diversion of international humanitarian aid to its military and the social elites, accounting for malnutrition among the general population. And as you pointed out as well, Mr. Chairman, in Ethiopia, food has been utilized as a weapon of war. From 83 to 85, the communist Derg starved people in Tigray, leading to an estimated 1 million famine deaths. The famine in Tigray was orchestrated by destroying civilian lives, food production capabilities, commerce, and forced resettlement. During the 84 famine, senior Derg officials stated that to kill the fish, you drain the water to justify its policy of mass starvation. Today, we see it repeating itself, sadly. Ethiopian government and Eritrean forces in Tigray are alleged to be using starvation as a weapon of war, with 700,000 people living in acute food insecurity conditions amid 2.2 million people who are internally displaced. In this seesawing conflict, both government forces and those affiliated with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front have been accused of restricting relief to those most in need. Today's hearing is necessary, and again, in a world beset by conflict, the weaponization of hunger and the inflicting death by starvation is heinous beyond all imagination. I thank you and yield back.
I want to thank you for your excellent statement and appreciate it. And we have two panels. Our first panel is Jocelyn Brown Hall. She's the director of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, Liaison Office for North America, based in Washington, D.C. Prior to this role, she served as the Deputy Regional Representative for the FAO Regional Office for Africa, where she oversaw 47 FAO country offices and guided strategy and communications around food security, agriculture, climate change, agri-food, trade, animal and plant health, among other topics. She also served as the FAO representative for Ghana. She has this incredible biography, which I'm going to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record because I want to get right to her testimony. But Ms. Hall, we are delighted that you are here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, Representative Jacobs, members of the Commission. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today on this timely matter, which is unfortunately an ever-present issue on conflict-driven hunger. I also want to add to my bio, because I think it might be important to this place, is that I worked in the U.S. Department of Agriculture for 23 years before joining FAO in 2019. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, we are the world's leading technical agency for food and agriculture. Our mandate is to achieve zero hunger through creating resilient and sustainable agri-food systems. We were founded before the end of World War II with the idea that the world came together understanding that we needed to understand better and have a better handle on global production, supply, demand, and food prices so that we could avoid the major conflicts, the global conflicts that World War II had brought upon this world. We have 195 members and are stationed over 130 countries, including many of the crisis-stricken countries that we will talk about today. We have actually people on the ground in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Eritrea, Ukraine. We'd like to think of ourselves as the International Department of Agriculture for the world because our work varies from normative research and standard setting on trade and food policies to farmer field training programs to crisis prevention and emergency agricultural assistance. As you have aptly put, armed conflict is a major driver of hunger crisis in our world today, but sadly, it is not the only one. The COVID-19 pandemic, its related supply chain issues and economic fallout, along with worsening climate change and extreme weather, have all exacerbated the state of world hunger. We call it the 3C. The 3Cs now added with the fourth one, the first one being climate, second one being conflict, the third one being economic downturn due to COVID, and the fourth is now rising food prices or cost. In Ukraine alone, FAO had a staff of 81 before the war broke out, and now we've added 30 more UN staff members. And there are 18 million food insecure citizens now. Before the war, there were 1 out of every 4 Ukrainians in Southeast Ukraine was facing food security, and now that is more than doubled. What is arguably even more jarring is that there's no end in sight, and that this may only be the beginning. As you noted, communities are destroyed and supply lines cut. And we've learned this morning that actually major wheat fields where wheat is a major, Ukraine is a major wheat producer for the world, that the fields are full of unexploded ordnances. This conflict stretches past Ukraine, plunging Yemen and Somalia further into food crises. And they have been reliant on Ukraine and Russia's agricultural output. Now, as FAO recently reported, Yemen's already dire hunger crisis is teetering on the edge of outright catastrophe, with 17.4 million people now in need of food assistance. That's almost the size of the state of the population of New York. While we in FAO cannot solve these conflicts themselves, we can help build stronger agricultural systems to help withstand the conflict-related shocks, even during times of conflict and war. We need to work towards these efficient and resilient systems and domestic agricultural production systems during conflicts so that we can save lives as they're happening. While this may seem like a tall order and perhaps a silver bullet, it's not. The good news is that pre-disaster resilience building is more cost efficient and has a track record of success. It costs $160 to feed a family of 7 in Afghanistan with some wheat seeds, some fertilizer, and a few tools. To feed that same family for 6 months, it costs about $1,200 on the local market, and that is before the food prices were increased. So we could tell that giving people the tools to produce and supply their own food is actually less expensive and more efficient than it is to directly feed them. By bringing attention to the complex nature and the roots of food insecurity through hearings such as the one today, we are taking important steps for the management and prevention of hunger crises. However, to implement this, we also need to properly allocate resources. We recommend first and foremost that the US government begin to treat agricultural assistance as a solution to the hunger crisis, as humanitarian assistance, not an afterthought. It needs to be at the center of humanitarian assistance, not on the margins. We understand that while reactive food assistance during crises is absolutely necessary, we have to get food to people, it is not sufficient. If we talk about the people today of Ukraine, they need vegetable seeds, they need potato seeds. They can be fed today, but what about 3 months from now or 4 months from now if the crisis continues on? We also need your voices to promote the continuation of international trade. Enacting import and export restrictions will raise prices, and that will affect the most vulnerable people in the world and further stagger food supplies. In addition to protect the nutritional status of vulnerable groups, it is essential that congresspersons such as yourselves help preserve social safety net programs and pair them with agricultural programs for the most needy amongst us. We ask that Congress proactively and consistently fund the mechanisms that prevent future hunger and starvation. We need to invest in humanitarian aid, but have agriculture as the center of it because it affects so many people. I failed to mention so far that over 70% of the people in crisis in the countries that we've mentioned are in the rural economy and have agriculture as their main source of income. So if you don't address agriculture and if you don't give people the seeds and the tools that they need to grow the food, they will not have anything, not only to eat, but to sell and to earn livelihoods for themselves. Our humanitarian response plan in Ukraine is funded only at $8 million. We're a shortfall, and we recognize that we would like you to recognize that agriculture is a key component of this humanitarian aid. Thank you again for this opportunity to brief you all, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And some of these things you've touched upon, but I just think for the record, I want to make sure that everybody's clear on it. Uh, for the record, could you identify for us the conflict-related hunger crises that are of greatest concern to FAO right now? Obviously, the situation in Ukraine, but if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Um,
Um, I won't say I'm happy to do so, but I'd
yeah,
be
right.
glad to do
Okay.
so, right?
Thank you.
So we have Horn of Africa, including Ethiopia, Somalia. We also have South Sudan. We also have Yemen and Syria. We have Ukraine, obviously. We don't want to forget the dry corridor or the people of Haiti. So those are kind of our top list. There's also major food insecurity on the border of Burma and Bangladesh.
And could you expand a little bit more on what exactly you mean by agricultural assistance and how it differs from direct food assistance?
That I'd be happy to answer. Um, Direct food assistance is obviously either procuring food nearby countries or shipping United States food, which the United States, through the Food for Peace law, has been shipping food for over half a century. So that is, direct handouts. That's what you see coming off the backs of planes or trucks. Um, Agriculture humanitarian assistance is providing people with seeds, some fertilizer, maybe a goat or a sheep or cattle, some veterinarian drugs if there's maybe a disease that can be handled quickly, some technical assistance. It's a package deal that we offer to families, and we offer it to the most vulnerable of families. We have a targeting scheme that we use so that those people can actually get food in the ground and harvest it and feed themselves. That's agricultural assistance in the humanitarian sphere.
And, and for those of us who are not in the agricultural sector, or don't have your background, I mean, would you be also referring to like providing equipment and seeds and stuff like that? And is there an example of this type of aid successfully mitigating a crisis?
For sure. So it has to do with wheat seeds, vegetable seeds, potato seeds, whatever calls for the day. At this point right now, we're actually feeding Ukrainian farmers. We've pivoted our programs away from commercial programs because right now markets are pretty dormant or unfortunately have stalled in Ukraine. So we pivoted that to actually life-saving food preservation programs where we're using those seeds to actually help the Ukrainian people, especially in the rural areas, feed themselves and or if they can ship that food, vegetables again, potatoes, to major cities where people don't grow food. I mentioned Afghanistan earlier. Throughout since August 2021, we have been providing wheat seed kits to Afghan rural peoples, and those kits were Afghanistan is a wheat import country. Wheat is a major staple crop for them. So we've been giving them seeds, some minor tools, so a little bit of fertilizer, and helping them grow the wheat themselves over the course of this time. And that package deal costs about $160, which compared to $1,200 to feed them that same wheat over a 6-month time period for a family of 7, you can see the direct benefit to those people who can actually grow it themselves, maybe sell a little bit on the market versus just receiving a handout.
So, so are you able to provide a measure of how efficient and long-lasting this type of assistance is, and as you said, insulating from conflict-related shocks?
Um, a direct measure would be, for example, I think the cost is one. I mean, it's obviously a lot less expensive, and we can reach probably more people because we're addressing families themselves. I will get you more specific measures from our office to that end, but I will say that in the humanitarian response arena, only 8% of all donor funding goes to the agricultural funding, the agricultural space of producing seeds and inputs for vulnerable people. And yet it's able to protect those people from literally dying of hunger during that time.
And in which countries and regions is the approach that you're talking about most advanced?
Well, unfortunately, we have to go where the most people are most vulnerable. So we use these agricultural humanitarian packages throughout the crises that you've mentioned today so far. Somalia, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan. We have a major program in Afghanistan where 95% of the population is facing some form of food insecurity, and almost half the population is in acute food insecurity. So we're working as fast as we can to get just the basics to people so that they literally don't starve to death or suffer chronic malnutrition.
And you talked about the cost-effective nature of agricultural assistance. What are the current monetary needs that you think are required for the current global needs?
Well, FAO is part of the United Nations overall system, and we don't work in a vacuum. We work together with others. So each country has what we call a humanitarian response plan. I will say, for example, in Afghanistan, the humanitarian response plan for the United Nations uh, is well funded, but FAO has received all of $500,000 from the United States for agricultural humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. Now, we've received funding from other donors, but that kind of gives you a sense that agriculture is often an afterthought. So the overall number, I'll have to get back to you on the overall number of the assistance, but again, each country has its own plan, and within that plan, we're often the most underfunded.
And, for the record, if nothing is done, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what are the potential risks to livelihoods here.
So in countries where 70 to 80% of the country is agrarian and where, 70% of the people are employed in the agricultural sector in some way, if people don't have anything to do or to work for, there's just there our representative in Afghanistan just said he brings some seeds to some farmers and you finally see some, a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They have nothing else. And in countries where women are not allowed outside the home, for example, I'll use Afghanistan again, agricultural livelihoods is the only path for them to have any sort of economic empowerment. It is acceptable to their culture for them to work in kitchen gardens or in with goats and sheep inside their compound. They don't go outside and harvest the way many women are often seen doing in Africa and throughout Latin America. But having them have some way of growing something, maybe selling some dairy, selling some vegetables on this, having their male members of their family sell that in on a side market. That is the only path to empowerment for these women in some of these countries where they're not allowed outside or outside their compound.
No, I look at I appreciate your testimony and also, getting us to think kind of beyond the same old, which is, respond with direct food only, which is kind of, you know, um, been a frustration of mine. I do a lot of anti-hunger work, not only globally, but domestically. And we're trying to get the White House right now to do a White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, Health, and Hunger to try to explore the challenges that we have here in the United States. Because one of my critiques about battling hunger and food insecurity in the United States is that the answer falls under multiple jurisdictions and multiple different approaches, and it's not just one program. It's not just one response. And the various sectors and agencies don't always get in a room together and say, here's the problem, what can we all put on the table it actually solve this problem? And and I and in the international arena, I mean, I've seen how thinking has evolved in many respects, but not quickly enough in the area of direct agricultural assistance to try to mitigate these disasters. I mean, there was a time when the U.S. felt that every time there was an emergency, our response should be we take food from the United States and we send it to wherever. And then we realized that it's not always cost effective, that sometimes it's better to buy food in the region or even in a particular country. But we have to be careful of that because we don't want to distort the markets in a way where food becomes unacceptably high for certain people. Um, and so, I think we're moving toward a, whatever works approach. Um, but then there's this issue of sustainability and mitigation that I always feel is a missing piece. And I'm struck by how little, in the scheme of things, the United States provides you for some of the work that you're talking about. And I really do think, you know, um, we need to be thinking more holistically and out of the box than we have a tendency to always do. Um, and we certainly appreciate the work of the FAO. I know my colleague Congressman Smith will be in and out because he had to go. He's got an emergency in his district. But I know Congresswoman Jacobs is here from California. I don't know whether you have any questions for Ms. Hall, or if so, I'll yield to you right now.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to you and Mr. Smith for convening this important hearing. I think obviously everything we've heard today just really shows how incredibly important this topic is, and we are seeing in real time in Ukraine right now that Russia's aggression in Ukraine threatens food security everywhere, given the impact on Ukraine's export of wheat and maize and barley, food that's needed and important in other conflict areas around the world, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. And we're also unfortunately seeing Russia deliberately target agricultural infrastructure in Ukraine and using hunger as a weapon of war. And that's exactly why I introduced a bipartisan resolution condemning the use of hunger as a weapon and recognizing the effect conflict has on global food security, and why I hope we can swiftly pass this resolution so Congress can speak with one voice on this issue. And Mr. Chairman, I know you've been an incredible leader on this for so many years. So Ms. Hall, I was hoping you could briefly speak to this dynamic we're seeing in Ukraine and how the U.S. and international community is responding.
Well, there's a major humanitarian response going on right now. And something I learned this morning is in each country which faces some sort of disaster or has, is in developing world work, there's something called the food security cluster. And this is where different UN bodies involved with food security, such as FAO, the World Food Program, as well as non-government organizations come together and kind of try to map out what they're doing and try to coordinate, because there can be, when you rush in of aid, you can sometimes trip over yourselves. So I learned this morning that before the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, there was about 40 entities involved in Ukraine's food security cluster, as they call it, and FAO and WFP co-chair this cluster. Now there's over 80 non-government organizations, and just trying to coordinate who's doing what, who's giving out what. But I also learned this morning that FAO is the only agency dealing with livelihoods or providing humanitarian aid that allows people to actually earn a living or see themselves as earning a living. I think your question was what the United States is doing in this area. Right now, the United States has been a stalwart supporter of the humanitarian response in Ukraine. Much of its funding is going towards direct food assistance, and we are more involved in the livelihoods and empowerment part. So we're looking to put seeds in the ground now for 3 months, or we're looking to making sure that the farmers who have put seeds in the ground can actually get them out and harvest them in May or June, because as you know, and you so aptly stated, Ukraine is a major producer. So the United States has been a major player within the whole UN community, and particularly we welcome its support in the livelihoods area as well, which has unfortunately been underfunded.
Yeah, I think that is an important component. So thank you for all of your work on that. Just switching gears a little bit more broad, I was wondering if you could talk about ways that hunger can actually lead to conflict, especially how hunger, food insecurity, increased fuel and commodity costs contributes to unrest and conflict, and and what kinds of long-term development interventions we can do to address these and help prevent conflict based on hunger.
Well, as the chairman aptly noted in his opening statement, hunger, we have enough food in this world to feed everybody. In fact, the United States alone could feed everyone in the world with the amount of food that we have. It's a question of distributing it to the people that need it. And yet, we have rising numbers of people who are food insecure. In the opening, the chairman mentioned that there's over 810 million people that are food insecure, and that is unfortunately an upswing. This shouldn't be the case. We have some of the most cutting edge technologies in the world in the United States. And so there's no reason for this number of people, but it is used sometimes as communities who are facing ongoing hunger. There can be land disputes. There can be, for example, there's oftentimes throughout Africa, disputes over land with nomadic peoples who are trying to use the land for livestock and things like that. There can be land grabs for, as part of a power grab within the government. So there's a lot of different reasons for this happening. The sad part of it is that even with the technologies that we have today, and even with some of the world not having as high yields in agriculture as they could, there are several countries, unfortunately, many countries that are actually underperforming in agriculture. Even with that, we have enough food to feed everyone.
Thank you. And then just one last question that I wanted to follow up on that I understand Chair McGovern wasn't able to get to, but you had talked about the more livelihood focused agricultural aid. What are the risks of that kind of aid you were describing earlier? And are the risks different from those for more traditional aid?
Well, I would say that they're really low risk. I mean, I think, we're trying to give people in their communities not a handout, but a hand up in the sense that we're trying to just enhance what they already know how to do. Of course, there are some risks in actually getting the seeds or the fertilizer to communities. There may be some risks in we don't have enough for all the communities that we need. So I would say it's actually a pretty low risk area. Now, of course, not every person who's involved in farming is a great farmer. That's true for any sector. And so that person, who's usually a man, may not be able to avail of everything. But for the most part, it's a low risk, high efficiency product and suite of products that also enhances what people already know how to do. These are rural people. This is what their livelihoods are all about. And with it, we try to do things like give them techniques to make sure that they're rotating their crops to preserve their soil, or we're trying to introduce maybe some drip irrigation so that they don't, in countries such as Ethiopia or Afghanistan where water is scarce, to, use the least amount of water possible. So in fact, I would say in many ways, it's even reducing even more risk to our climate, and trying to use these moments, these teachable moments, to enhance their understanding of their soil, of their wind patterns, of fertilizer. There was a discussion this morning in FAO that the lack of fertilizer is upon us due to the war, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is going to, it's obviously going to impact all of us, but it even shows more of how we need to have soil mapping, and we need to know what's in the soil so that we're using the right fertilizer. So as I would say, to answer your question, it's a pretty low risk, high efficiency intervention.
Well, thank you. And that was all of my questions. So, Chair McGovern, I will yield back to you now.
Well, thank you very much. And Ms. Hall, thank you for your testimony, for answering the questions. Thank you for the innovative work that's being done at FAO. This issue of hunger, especially in times of crisis, I always get the feeling that that there is not the sense of global urgency that is needed at this moment. Quite frankly, there ought to be a sense of global urgency even when, half the world's not in, in crisis. These are solvable issues. And I like, and I visited, when I was in Ethiopia a few years ago, I think it's called the Protective Safety Net program. I think that I may be messing up what they were called, but I saw the drip irrigation experiments going on, and some really out of the box thinking. Uh, and in that case, it was basically prepare people, for droughts or crazy weather patterns that we're all experiencing right now. And they've had they've helped. And there's lots of out of the box thinking out there about ways to help people be able to get through crises, whether they're natural or whether they're man-made. Um, but we need to be moving more in that direction. We need to be having more thoughtful discussion in our Congress about this stuff and about where some of our funding goes. Uh, and this is my own personal opinion, so I don't attribute to anybody else here. But it just frustrates me that when it comes to the military budget, there's never enough. But when it comes to making sure that people have enough to eat, we're told we do enough. We can't do much more. And yet, when you look at some of the causes of instability around the world, and certainly the causes of human suffering, you can tie directly to, hunger and extreme poverty. So, in any event, uh, I think you have given us, kind of a reminder that we need to do better. And so I thank you so much for being here, and thank you and your team for all the great work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now we're going to go to our second panel. Um, uh, Tom Denenbaum is an assistant professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Prior to joining Fletcher in 2017, he was a lecturer in human rights at University College London and a visiting lecturer in law uh, um, and Robina Foundation visiting human rights fellow at Yale Law School. Professor Denenbaum writes on international law, focusing primarily on the laws of war, the law on the use of force, international criminal law, shared responsibility, and international judging. He's also written on peace negotiations, terror strategy, reparations, and the philosophical basis for punishing atrocity crimes perpetrated via the state. His many publications include the article Siege Starvation, a War Crime of Societal Torture, which was awarded the Legal Theory Prize by ASIL in 2022. He holds a BA from Stanford, a JD from Yale, and a PhD from Princeton. Katrina Murdoch is an international criminal and human rights lawyer with expertise in the crime of starvation, associated starvation violations, and right to food abuses. She's a barrister with One Crown Office Row Chambers in the United Kingdom and a partner with Global Rights Compliance, an international legal foundation that pursues justice through innovative application of international law. Ms. Murdoch leads GRC's starvation portfolio and is deeply knowledgeable about the cycle of conflict and hunger across Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and Tigray. Ms. Murdoch has practiced international criminal law, advising on crimes arising out of the Rwanda genocide, the Iraq War, the current conflicts in Yemen, and the war in the former Yugoslavia. Let me begin with uh, uh, Tom Denenbaum. We welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Government. Civilian starvation and the deprivation of objects indispensable to civilian survival are among the most devastating features of contemporary armed conflict. The effects are torturous, individually and socially destructive, and potentially transgenerational in their implications. For tens of millions of civilians across numerous conflict zones, including those in Syria, Myanmar, Yemen, Tigray in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Ukraine, this is not simply the result of intractable scarcity or natural disaster. It is the product of choices about how to conduct war. This panel has been asked whether and how international humanitarian law may have a role to play in responding to this reality. The answer to that question is that existing law does indeed provide crucial resources, prohibiting and criminalizing the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, protecting objects indispensable to civilian survival, and regulating humanitarian access. What is needed is the political will necessary to employ those tools. In what follows, I will first explain what makes objects indispensable to civilian survival legally distinctive in the regime governing the conduct of hostilities. Second, I'll emphasize what that means, what implications it has for encirclement or siege deprivation. And finally, I'll foreground some mechanisms for implementation. So first, on the special place of objects indispensable to civilian survival. Ordinarily, an object with both military and civilian uses, a so-called dual-use object, is considered a military objective under the law of armed conflict. That means it can be targeted, as long as feasible measures are taken to minimize civilian loss, and the civilian impact expected is not excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Those are extremely important, but situationally contingent restrictions, the details of which are often contested. It is in recognition of the stakes for the civilian population that objects indispensable to civilian survival, such as food, water, and the systems by which they are produced and supplied, get clearer and tighter protection under Protocols 1 and 2 additional to the Geneva Conventions and associated customary international law. Specifically, even if such objects are used not just by civilians but also by combatants, two bright line prohibitions still apply. First, objects indispensable to survival cannot be targeted for their sustenance value unless they provide sustenance exclusively to combatants. In other words, unlike targetable dual-use objects, dual-use sustenance is legally protected. Second, objects indispensable to survival cannot be targeted even on the basis of a direct military contribution other than sustenance if such targeting would leave the civilian population starving or forced to move. Both of these unique rules apply whether or not civilians are the primary target, regardless of motive and independent of assessments of military advantage. They are bright lines designed to protect civilians from starvation in war. Now, of course, attacking and destroying indispensable objects are only two modalities of starvation. Others include removing such objects from the civilian population, rendering such objects useless, or indeed cutting civilians off from the external supply of such objects. Removing and rendering useless are explicitly covered by the same framework as attacking and destroying under Additional Protocol 1. About that, there is no ambiguity. In my view, the most coherent reading of the law is that the framework on indispensable objects specifies what it means to engage in starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, which is prohibited regardless of the modality, and thus applies also to encirclement deprivation. As such, in the context of siege isolation, the first legal question is whether the supply of indispensable objects is being deliberately blocked. If yes, the next question is whether the purpose is to deny sustenance, even to combatants, in a context in which that denial will also impact civilians. If yes, the operation is prohibited. Alternatively, when consignments of indispensable objects are blocked for military reasons other than denying their sustenance value, the question is whether conditions are such that the civilian population will be left starving or forced to move. If yes, the operation is again prohibited. The reason for these elevated restrictions is the profound and indeed torturous suffering associated with starvation. But those effects occur over time, and they can be complicated to trace causally. It's for that reason that it's critical to emphasize that the legal protections focus in the first instance on the practices of belligerent parties with respect to indispensable objects. Let me conclude by spotlighting 3 ways to leverage this legal framework. First, a key aspect is attention. With Security Council Resolution 2417, there is a framework for keeping this at the top of the Security Council's agenda. But that requires states, including the United States, to maintain the focus in that forum. Second, it's important that all states, including the United States, codify the starvation war crime in their domestic war crimes codes and provide the jurisdictional basis for applying those codes to any alleged offender who's found on their territory. Third, war crimes investigators in various jurisdictions need to be supported in their work on this issue. The legal framework is there, but they need evidence, resources, and access to make it work. All states should assist them in that endeavor. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Murdoch.
Thank you. I would like to follow on from my esteemed representatives by addressing 4 further points. The first is to continue to frame the issue of starvation, highlighting the importance of both the resolution but also the Rome Statute amendment to the International Criminal Court. Second, how the crime can manifest in practice. Third, how the organisation I work with, Global Rights Compliance, monitors starvation violations and how we work to further accountability. And I'll do that by giving 3 examples of 3 current conflicts that we're working in, and then 4 to end with some options for action. So taking the first and framing the issue, as has already been discussed, over the past 4 years, we have witnessed the return of famine and the rise of the deliberate use of starvation as a method of warfare. The conflicts in Ukraine, Tigray, Syria, South Sudan, Myanmar, Yemen, and others, to name a few, reveal the devaluing of human life and the erosion of international laws and norms that are designed to protect civilians in conflict. In relation to the Security Council Resolution 2417, as has already been discussed, this explicitly condemns the deliberate use of starvation and recognises the violation as a war crime for which perpetrators may be held accountable. But what was also important about this landmark resolution was that investigations were called for, reporting lines were created, and a new momentum arose around the issue. And carried by that momentum, in December 2019, through a Swiss-led proposal, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court was amended to include starvation as a war crime in a non-international armed conflict. Now, given that apart from Ukraine, all other current conflicts where starvation features are classed as a non-international armed conflict, the importance of this amendment cannot be underestimated. We were fortunate enough to work with Switzerland and the Netherlands during the amendment process, and we continue to do so in relation to their efforts to increase ratification. But I would strongly concur with Mr. Dennebaum that codifying this prohibition will certainly strengthen the legal framework. Turning then to the second point and what this crime can look like in conflict. As Tom has outlined, there are so many different facets to conflict and hunger. And we've seen and heard about siege warfare. But today I wanted to highlight the humanitarian access violations, given Chairman McGovern's commitment to humanitarian access and relief issues. A cornerstone to international humanitarian law is the unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief and the absolute prohibition on the willful obstruction of it. But yet there is a tendency perhaps to view this obstruction of humanitarian aid as a slightly lesser crime. And whereas an airstrike on a grain store, for example, may hit the headlines, hindering the movement of indispensable supplies will usually not. But yet often you will find that a party who restricts access or obstructs aid in that way will have a nexus with other violations. And indeed, the lack of respect for international humanitarian law will often be telling in relation to a perpetrator's intent. Turning to the select investigations that we're working on at the moment, this is amongst other violations the type of work that we monitor and investigate in current conflicts. And there are a variety of ways in which the crime can be monitored and investigated depending on the stage of the conflict. To give 3 current examples, Yemen. This was the genesis of our work on starvation, and we have conducted extensive field investigations over a number of years and produced a unique report with legal findings. This analysis enabled us to test the law, take witness statements, and really, as Mr. Dannenbaum describes, identify some of the bright lines in practice and disentangle what is and isn't permissible. And then there's Tigray, which has already been discussed in the opening address. We are 18 months into this conflict, and over 400,000 people in the region are starving, according to the World Food Programme's latest assessment. We commend the leading role that the United States has taken in relation to Tigray, condemning the mass atrocities, referring to 2417 and issuing sanctions. In Tigray, we are working with Bellingcat in a unique open source investigation, given our inability to get into the country. And here we're looking at specific incidents, again, relating to the destruction of foodstuffs, food storage facilities, the obstruction of humanitarian access, and attacks specifically on aid workers. And then finally turning to Ukraine, where we have worked since 2014. As many of you will know and has been discussed already today, the situation in Ukraine in relation to conflict and hunger and starvation violations is acute. The situation in Mariupol, in particular, remains extremely dire, where it has been besieged since the first days of the war. Here there is a grave lack of access to medical supplies, healthcare facilities, and the targeting of objects indispensable. Local residents are deprived of water, they're drinking snow, and food, electricity, and heat has been blocked. And also, humanitarian aid convoys have been blocked from accessing the city. They're looted on their way in, and routes selected for these convoys are being mined, alongside civilians being blocked from leaving. Now, ascertaining whether the aforementioned conduct in Ukraine and elsewhere would meet the requisite intent to starve is not easy. But the overwhelming circumstantial evidence across all 3 conflicts points to a clear practice of deliberate starvation. The evidence base for starvation crimes is accumulating daily alongside other war crimes in Ukraine and elsewhere. And then finally, the options for action. The ultimate aim of our work is to render starvation morally toxic, and there is much that can be done both individually and collectively to achieve this goal. And similar to the 3 steps that have already been identified, I would raise 3 to echo those. Call it out, investigate it, and prosecute it. There's an urgent need to increase the literacy around the notion of starvation violations across a range of sectors, from the police, immigration departments, war crimes units, forensic analysis, open source investigators, journalists, courts, and tribunals, and within humanitarian agencies. Capacity building will be key to achieve this. It is critical to identify this violation and call it out loudly when we see it or suspect it. And then investigations, as has been discussed, these are of course essential. In Ukraine, the State Department's Office of Global Criminal Justice has already earmarked funding for mobile teams of international experts who will be working shoulder to shoulder with investigators looking to secure crime scene evidence. There is still a process to go through before that funding is released, including congressional approval, and we would respectfully encourage that to be expedited. The longer that this continues without international war crime specialists on the ground, the more evidential opportunities will be lost. And then finally, accountability. Given the prevalence of starvation in current conflicts, this needs to become part and parcel of international crimes and investigations. An international criminal prosecution for the crime of starvation, whilst long overdue, is not the only panacea. We must look for a full suite of tools, legal or advocacy-based, including domestic prosecutions, universal jurisdiction claims, claims before relevant UN treaty bodies, and as we saw by the resolution that was passed, sanctions and other means as well. It is time for our tacit tolerance of weaponized starvation to end. The evidence is in our faces, the law is in our hands, but what is lacking, as has already been discussed today, is the public clamour and political leadership. Starvation crimes should be put in their rightful place at the head of the list of acts of inhumanity, so reprehensible that they are prohibited without question. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both for your excellent testimony. I'm going to yield to Ms. Jacobs for questions first, and then I'll ask mine after that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of our witnesses. To either of you, can you speak to why you think the prosecution for intentional starvation under IHL has been so rare? Is it ascribing intent, especially to top government officials or military commanders, the key challenge to such prosecutions, or what has been the biggest barrier?
Tom, shall I go first? And then
Why don't you go first? I'll follow up.
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question. So I think there's a variety of reasons why it hasn't been part of a prosecution to date. I think to some extent the facts just didn't arise in previous conflicts that we saw. So, for example, in the Rwandan genocide and other conflicts, it just wasn't part and parcel of the factual matrix. I think in the other sort of a procedural reason would be that before some of the ad hoc tribunals, so the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and indeed Cambodia, despite particularly in Cambodia there being significant starvation-related deaths, it wasn't part of the statute of those courts, so it wasn't part and parcel of something that could have been prosecuted. And then I think you touched upon a really important point, which is I think the intent is one that I think gives cause to concern for investigators and prosecutors. I think there's this multi-causal nature and multi-causes faceted effect of starvation, which I think has given it a wrong reputation or an erroneous reputation for being overly difficult to prosecute. And then I think, as I touched upon in the presentation, I think that, or in my evidence, is that I think it's just too often been viewed as a humanitarian law issue and not a criminal one. And I think the focus has been on relief rather than atrocity commission. Those would be, I think, just four reasons. But Tom, I don't know if you've got a few.
Yeah, I can add a couple more just briefly. I think one key issue has been that, and this Katrina mentioned this earlier, the International Criminal Court statute initially included the starvation war crime only for international armed conflicts, in other words, conflicts between states in Article 82B25, and only in 2019 was it updated to extend to non-international armed conflicts. The predominant mode of conflict globally is non-international armed conflict, so that whole form of armed conflict was not subject to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court on the specific issue of starvation war crimes. And so now, of course, we have an international armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine where this particular war crime is implicated and where the ICC has jurisdiction. So maybe we'll see progress there. Even in non-international armed conflicts where there is now this amendment at the ICC, it only extends on a state-by-state basis as ratifications occur, and so it's still unlikely to be available in most of the situations that arise there. The second thing is on this question of intent, I think it's partly about a confusion about exactly what needs to be shown with respect to establishing the crime. That's why in my remarks I was emphasizing that this is really about the deprivation of objects indispensable to civilian survival, and then that is done to deny sustenance or with a view to recognizing that starvation will occur, but you don't have to prove a specific outcome from the deprivation of those objects. That's not an element of the crime. And so there's maybe a reticence to engage in this particular line of prosecutorial strategy because of a concern that how do you prove that this particular act caused this particular outcome in a context where there are multiple intervening factors and the link between action and result is long and tortuous in terms of the various ways in which factors intervene with one another. But the fact is you don't actually have to establish that. What you have to establish is that these objects were deprived deliberately and that either there was the intent to deny sustenance or that there was a recognition, given the conditions in place, that that would leave civilians starving. That's enough. You don't have to prove the causation, but I do think that under other legal categories, the concern about causation was a major one that precluded the necessary investigation and prosecution.
Okay, thank you so much. That was really helpful. I guess another question is, how might efforts to document the evidence of starvation, famine, and deprivation be improved to make these prosecutions? I know you said it wasn't only about the evidence collection, but in so much as part of it is, how can we make sure we're doing that part better?
Do you want to go ahead again, Katrina? Or?
You go first and I'll follow up.
Yeah, so I think one of the key issues is making sure that collecting evidence at the right moment and accumulating evidence over time, particularly when you're looking at the deprivation of humanitarian access. Any given denial of access is not necessarily itself going to be criminal. So it's not the case that all convoys have to be allowed through. And so it's a question of accumulating what decisions are being made, what was known at what point with respect to those decisions, and how does the system of this particular encirclement or denial of access operate. That requires accumulating that evidence over time in terms of what are the interactions between each of those actors, what do they know at each point, what's the situation on the ground and how is it changing, what kinds of additional evidence would you look for? So when you're looking, for example, at the denial of humanitarian access, something that's going to be extremely helpful in establishing that that's the intentional denial of humanitarian access with a view to denying sustenance is, are the actors in question also looting, also destroying objects indispensable to survival? If those things are happening together, then the case that there is intentional deprivation is that much clearer. And that's, for example, what has been shown in Tigray in Ethiopia, where there's clearly an accumulation of those different acts. And the question is then how to make sure that when we're looking for evidence in the moment, we're doing it throughout the process. We're not putting these issues of humanitarian access and attacks on indispensable objects to one side because we're focused exclusively on kinetic attacks on civilians or other war crimes that are more traditionally prosecuted, and that is then ready for prosecution when cases become viable. And right now in the current context, so that includes making sure that investigations are going to be viable in Ukraine, but it also means making sure that that kind of information is available to the investigative mechanism for Syria and the investigative mechanism for Myanmar, because both of those are also contexts in which these acts are occurring. And the important point is not to put these to one side as a humanitarian issue that are not relevant for prosecution, but to include them in that case development and evidentiary accumulation. And as I said, I think that means a multifaceted, comprehensive analysis of what's going on the ground and how it's coordinated.
Yeah, I don't have very much to add on to that. I think that's a really excellent answer. I think all I would say was that it goes back to this need to increase the literacy on it. So this sort of capacity building point, so that those with an investigative mandate, from commissions of inquiry to humanitarian actors to a whole range of justice actors who are involved in this, are encouraged and supported to be able to identify this as a violation and have the means with which to deposit that information safely, anonymously, and credibly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was all of my questions, so I will yield to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Let me, Mr. Denenbaum, the ability of the U.S. to advocate for accountability for war crimes and frankly all serious human rights abuses is greatest when we not only talk the talk, but when we walk the walk. You recommend that states codify the starvation war crime and their domestic war crimes codes and provide the jurisdictional basis for applying those codes to any alleged offender who is found on their territory. So for the United States, I just want to be clear, what specific statutes need to be amended? what jurisdictions would be most relevant? Are there legislative proposals already available that you're aware of?
Yeah, so I believe this is actually one of the issues on which Senators Durbin and Graham are working in response to the specific situation in Ukraine. But one of the key problem codes, if you like, is 18 US Code 2441, which is the War Crimes Act from 1996. It provides the list of war crimes applicable in the United States. And there are two issues. One is that the starvation war crime is not included. So it includes a list of grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions and Common Article 3, but does not include starvation war crime. But the second issue, which is equally important, is that the jurisdictional provision is that although the crime can occur inside or outside of the United States, it has to be the case that either the perpetrator or the victim is either a member of the US Armed Forces or a national of the United States. That's actually more limited than the Geneva Convention's demand, which is to provide the legislation necessary to ensure criminal prosecution of any alleged offender found in the territory, regardless of the nationality of that perpetrator and regardless of the individual's, the territory on which the crime occurred. The United States has that kind of jurisdictional basis for child soldiering, torture, and genocide in other parts of the code. So I can give the specific numbers if that's helpful. And so the first move would be to make sure that it extends that to war crimes, as indeed is required under the Geneva Conventions. The second would then be to expand the substantive scope of the war crimes that the United States recognizes in its legislation to include the starvation war crime, recognizing that although the United States is not party to Additional Protocol 1, it has affirmed that ban both in its Department of Defense Law of War Manual and through Security Council Resolution 2417, which calls for investigations and calls for accountability. And so the United States recognizes this to be a violation. It should recognize it to be a war crime, and it should include it in its domestic code and extend the jurisdiction so that it's able to hold alleged offenders responsible as is required under international law. I think you were on mute if you just asked the second question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Is it important for the U.S. to ratify additional protocols?
Yes, I think it should ratify additional protocols 1 and 2. It's notable in this respect. Additional Protocol 1 has 174 states that are party to it. Both Russia and Ukraine are party to it, so they can help be responsible under the terms of Additional Protocol 1. Almost every key US ally, certainly the formal allies, are party to Additional Protocol 1. All NATO members, except for the United States and Turkey, Australia and New Zealand, the Republic of Korea and Japan are all party to Additional Protocol 1. And so when the United States is operating, and when it's operating together with allies, it already more or less has to comply with the terms of Additional Protocol 1 in order to maintain interoperability. So it would be not only appropriate in terms of the operations of the US Armed Forces, but normatively appropriate to affirm the standards in Additional Protocol 1, affirm the prohibition of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, and incorporate that into domestic US law so as to have the legitimacy and standing to call out abuses, including the abuses that are currently being inflicted in Tigray, in Ukraine, etc., in a way that has moral legitimacy.
Okay. So in last July, you published an article in Just Security titled "Famine in Tigray: Humanitarian Access and the War Crime of Starvation," in which you concluded there is good reason to believe that the extraordinary deprivation being inflicted on the people of Tigray could satisfy the criminal threshold for starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. Has anything happened since then that's changed your analysis? Should Congress and the administration be doing more to draw attention to this particular war crime alongside others that have been widely reported, including rape, mass detentions, and forcible transfers of people?
So the answers to those respectively are no and yes. No, nothing has changed to change my view on that. And yes, the United States should be doing more to make sure that this particular situation receives the attention it deserves. I think it's really important and helpful that the international community is responding with such profound unity and cooperation in response to the crimes that are occurring in Ukraine. That's important. But it's also important that that not be the only time when we see this surge of political will around these issues. Tigray is a clear context in which that surge would be appropriate. There isn't international criminal court jurisdiction. There isn't the kind of investigative mechanism that we have for Syria or Myanmar. The United States could be a leader in developing such an investigative mechanism, in pushing for accountability efforts using universal jurisdiction. That's a case, for example, where the War Crimes Act amendment that I suggested would be particularly helpful, but also facilitating universal jurisdiction investigations of the crimes occurring in Tigray in those jurisdictions where that's already viable, which is a significant number. Many of those have been very active on Syria. They've been much less active on Tigray. US assistance in that respect would be, I think, extremely helpful and important.
Ms. Murdoch, you mentioned in your statement that global rights compliance has been engaged in Ukraine since 2014, helping to strengthen Ukraine's capacity to investigate and prosecute international crimes. So with regard to Donbass and Crimea, is there evidence that war crimes were committed there? And if so, which crimes and by whom? And is there evidence that the prohibition on starvation as a method of war was violated in these regions? Or is this a new war crime that has appeared since Russia's invasion in February?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, we have released earlier, about 2 months ago now, an extensive occupation report which details a vast number of crimes against humanity and war crimes in relation to Crimea and Donbass, and forensically analyzes the situation of occupation there predating the current conflict and current invasion. We did look in that assessment and analysis on the attacks on water facilities in particular, and whether that may amount to the crime of starvation in that earlier iteration of the conflict. I would say, though, that the vast majority of crimes that we're seeing that fall within the purview of starvation, either as a war crime or as a crime against humanity, are routinely occurring in the most recent invasion. So I think that would be, it's absolutely critical that is investigated, and that accountability initiatives that are springing up all around fully consider this issue, and that it isn't once again marginalized.
Let me ask, and for you both, I mean, given the significant evidence of starvation and destruction of resources essential to survival in armed conflict generally, why has prosecution for intentional starvation under IHL been so rare?
Well, it goes back to what we were discussing earlier, that partly there wasn't the codification early. So there wasn't the codification in the International Criminal Tribunal statutes that were created in the revival of international criminal law in the 1990s. The codification in the ICC statute was limited to international armed conflicts, which weren't the dominant mode of armed conflict, and certainly are not the dominant mode of armed conflict that the ICC has had jurisdiction over. Even in Additional Protocol 1, it wasn't included as a grave breach, and so there was less uptake in domestic war crimes codes initially, although that's now changing with the criminalization at the International Criminal Court and with the encouragement of Security Council Resolution 2417. So I think it's changing, but it's partly about updating the law, which is happening, and then changing attitudes.
Yeah. Because of Ukraine's role as a grain producer, Russia's war of aggression is already affecting agricultural markets and exacerbating pre-existing food insecurity. Does Russia bear any legal responsibility for these downstream consequences under international law? Again, either one of you or both can answer that. Maybe we'll go, Ms. Murdoch, we'll begin with you.
So I think it's a really, really important question, the knock-on effects that this is going to have, particularly on food insecure countries, those that are already teetering on the edge. And I think we heard very eloquently about the resilience and issues that is going to have by our first speaker from Ms. Hall. In terms of Russia's state responsibility for those, for downstream impact, I think is going to be very, very challenging, in that they have not adopted under the international human rights law framework a number of the right to food frameworks there. So I think finding the link and a causal link between Russia in that instance and those downstream effects is going to be, in terms of a sort of criminal accountability or international human rights law accountability, would be fairly fraught in my view. But I don't know, Tom, if you...
Yeah, I think it's certainly complicated. It gets to the issue of proximate cause and at what point a particular wrongful act underpins responsibility with respect to consequences. A couple of just quick notes is that in the context of state responsibility for the effects of aggression or violations of the prohibition on the use of force, the International Court of Justice in the case between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda did find Uganda responsible for all of the upshots of that violation of the prohibition of the use of force, but those were upshots within the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so this question of what kinds of implications flow beyond that, I think, is more complicated. The one other thing I'd note is that the civilian population that's protected under Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1, which would be the relevant article for the purposes of starvation implications here, is not limited to the civilian population of the adverse party or the civilian population that has a particular nationality or connection to the conflict. But again, I think the difficulty would be showing that there's a sufficient proximate cause between this wrongful act and civilian populations beyond to render that plausibly covered within the starvation prohibition. I think that would be possible if we're talking about the impact of civilian population across a border that's affected by the deprivation of indispensable objects to that region generally. But we're talking about the broader economic effects. I think that's a much harder legal challenge, which is not to say that it's something that shouldn't be pursued and considered, but I don't think it's a straightforward one.
In your opinion, when might the use of starvation against the civilian population constitute the crime of genocide? Are there any past or present situations involving intentional starvation or other privation that you would characterize as genocide? Ms. Murdoch?
Yes, yeah, I think absolutely. I think the only instance that comes from a sort of criminal perspective straight to mind is in the Bashir indictment, in arrest warrant, I beg your pardon, under the crime of genocide. There was a reference there in that arrest warrant to the tactics of poisoning wells, which had a knock-on effect of course, civilian death and harm to those that were using those objects in those wells. I think it's very clear within the makeup of genocide that starvation could quite well fit within that. And I think in Tigray, there has been a lot of discussion about the rhetoric and the language of genocide and whether that, within the sort of matrix of that pattern, whether that could fit within some of the starvation violations that we're seeing there. But I think there's a very clear link between both violations. And I think there's a number of instances where it would be appropriate to pursue that.
Mr. Denenbaum?
Yeah, so sorry, Katrina. So there's a couple of things to say. First is when you're looking at genocide, there are 5 possible underlying acts. The one that's most relevant here is inflicting the conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group. So causing starvation in a particular region would be inflicting those kinds of conditions of life. But then the question is, do you have genocidal intent in the case in question? And that's always the threshold challenge with respect to genocide, showing that the wrongful acts were undertaken with the intent to destroy a racial, ethnic, national, or religious group in whole or in part. And that's often in criminal law understood to mean substantial part. And so that's always the challenge. That's, I think, part of the issue in the Omar al-Bashir indictment that was already mentioned, whether that threshold will be satisfied before the International Criminal Court or any other court that would ultimately hear that case. That would be similarly the key issue in the context of Tigray. I think clearly you have the infliction of conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of the population in question. But the question is, does that rise to genocidal intent? Is the intent to destroy a particular racial, ethnic, national, or religious group? As such, that's always the challenge. But there are also crimes against humanity. So it's not just the war crime of starvation and genocide. There are crimes against humanity. The most relevant here would be extermination, which is mass murder, where you don't need to show that specific destructive intent, or other inhumane acts, which is a broader residual category within crimes against humanity, and which has been invoked in the context of North Korea.
And let me just ask: do either of you see prospects for prosecuting starvation crimes in Yemen?
I think the biggest issue in that context is jurisdictional. So the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction, and so the question would be: is another court, whether it's a domestic court exercising universal jurisdiction or otherwise, going to pursue a prosecution? The one area where there is potential jurisdiction is with respect to complicity in that particular conduct, and that goes to questions of arms supply to belligerents in that particular conflict, and the point at which that kind of supply would rise to the level of criminal complicity, which is a high threshold. But there you would potentially have the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, in light of the fact that some of those who are providing significant arms to the Saudi-led coalition in the context of Yemen are parties to the International Criminal Court. Otherwise, I think it's a challenging one jurisdictionally, certainly with respect to the principal perpetrators.
Ms. Murdoch, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think, I mean, it's a really difficult situation for a number of reasons, which I'm sure many are aware of. But I think that one of the challenges that is facing with Yemen in terms of universal jurisdiction claims that you've seen in other cases is that with Yemen, you don't tend to have the population movement like you do with Syria or in other contexts. So you haven't seen the sort of diaspora of Yemenis moving across Europe, which may or may engage or trigger jurisdiction in some of those countries. So there's that problem. And then the second challenge that we have is just, and I won't go into the political side of things, but the closure of the last investigative mechanism, the group of eminent experts for Yemen, the Human Rights Council voted for that not to be extended this year. And there really is very little other existing bodies now to receive this kind of information. So I think there's a number of really significant challenges, and that's why an investigative mechanism looking at Yemen and looking at the starvation acts that are there is really critical, in my view.
Yeah, I want to thank you both for your testimony and for your answers to the questions. I mean, we've had a discussion about this crime that is very rarely heard up here, so but I appreciate that. I want to give you all, and I know Ms. Hall is still on the call, even though you're on a different panel, and I don't want to violate any protocol. But if there are additional comments that anybody wants to make for the record, I would certainly welcome them. And Mr. Dunnebaum, we can begin with you. If there's anything you would like to add that you think is important for the record, and then we'll go down. And Ms. Hall, if you want to, you can. If you don't have to. But let's begin with you, Mr. Dunnebaum.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. So the only thing I would just want to add in terms of steps that the United States specifically could take. So I mentioned some in my opening statement. One thing that came to light in the last couple of days in New York Times reporting were some of the legislative impediments to United States cooperation with the International Criminal Court, investigating, in particular in this context in Ukraine, but generally the impediments legislatively to US cooperation through both the 1999 appropriations law that limits the government providing financial and material items to support the International Criminal Court, and then the 2002 American Service Members Protection Act, which limits other forms of support. I really hope that the situation in Ukraine prompts a revision of those impediments, prompts greater United States cooperation and open cooperation with the International Criminal Court, not just in the context of Ukraine, but more broadly, and that this is an opportunity to reassess the United States posture towards the International Criminal Court and understand that it's actually in US national interest to support this institution and to ultimately become party to it, but certainly cooperate with it in an effective way across multiple different investigations and situations. And thank you for holding this hearing on this extremely important issue. I appreciate it.
And for what it's worth, I agree with you. Ms. Murdoch.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think the only thing I would like to end on is really just to reiterate the point about the importance of these critical early investigations across a number of conflicts, particularly in Ukraine at the moment, and the real key need to preserve that critical evidence now before it is lost or before it becomes tampered with. And that is the case across a number of different conflicts, whether there is an accountability jurisdictional mechanism or available mechanism for that evidence to be heard. The importance is the preservation of evidence here and now in the event that future accountability mechanisms are able to deal with that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to raise this really important subject, and I'm grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you. And Ms. Hall?
Thank you so much, Chairman McGovern. My final comment would be to reiterate some of your words, which are this is the hunger that we face in the world today is a solvable problem. There is no magic here. We produce enough food. It's a question of getting it to the right people at the right time. And it is, to echo what my colleagues on a different panel have said, it's just a matter of political will. And it is within our grasp. And to put agriculture at the center of humanitarian crises so that we can get to the most vulnerable people, the people who are really in need right now, is what FAO is all about, and what I hope is a takeaway for this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you. Look, I always tell people that hunger, is a political condition, right? I mean, it's not like we don't have the food or the resources or the ability to help people get what they need. It is the political will, and that goes for times of conflict and when things are relatively calm. But there are other factors that play a role in hunger. And I just say, the reason why I thought this hearing was important. Look at people always talk about the cruelty of war, but that food is weaponized, that people are denied just basic sustenance as a weapon of war is especially cruel. And that there are entities, leaders, governments, even non-governmental players that intentionally engage in that kind of warfare, I think is beyond unconscionable. And but it's happening now, right? It's happening in a number of the countries that we talked about, and I think we need to elevate this topic because I do think there should be a consequence for those who engage in this kind of behavior. Look, I'm someone who believes that food is a fundamental human right for every single human being on this planet, and I, as a member of Congress, I'm embarrassed and ashamed that close to 40 million people in this country don't know where the next meal is going to come from. I feel the same way about global hunger, and I feel that we need to have better responses when hunger is basically used as a weapon of war. And some of that is how we respond in the courts. Some of that is mitigation. Some of that is, you know, creating models that can sustain difficult periods that people are forced to go through. But anyway, this has been a very useful hearing, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time, and thank you for your work as well. And if in the coming days and weeks something should hit you that we should be doing more of here in Congress, please reach out to us. This is a bipartisan commission. We work in a bipartisan way, and so we have a history of being able to move things when we come to agreement. So, but having said that, I thank you all very much. Please be safe, and we will talk to you soon. This concludes the hearing.